This is when Gen X ruled the multiplex, the films that shaped the MTV generation. A few episodes back in my analysis of St. Elmo's Fire, I touched on the rise of Gen X literature in the mid-80s. Jay McInerney's Bright Lights, Big City and Bret Easton Ellis's Less Than Zero both made immediate waves upon publication for their vivid depictions of the lives of shallow, disaffected, and status-obsessed young people. Their work struck a chord with Gen X readers, and McInerney and Ellis became charter members of a group of young authors that the Village Voice dubbed the Literary Brat Pack. Ellis wrote Less Than Zero while he was still an undergraduate at Bennington College in southwestern Vermont, where his classmates included future literary powerhouses Donna Tartt and Jonathan Lethem, and the film rights to Less Than Zero were optioned by 20th Century Fox before the book was even published. The 1987 film version was directed by British filmmaker Mark Kanievska, known for 1984's Another Country, which starred Colin Firth and Rupert Everett. A draft of the screenplay was written by playwright Michael Christopher, who'd won a Pulitzer for his 1977 play The Shadow Box. Christopher's draft was pretty faithful to Ellis's book, but the producers rejected it because they thought it should be less cynical and more sentimental. If you've ever read Less Than Zero or anything by Ellis, like, say, American Psycho, you know that any kind of sentiment is completely at odds with Ellis, who is a darkly satirical and dispassionate writer. Harley Peyton, who went on to become a writer and producer on Twin Peaks, wrote the draft of the script that was ultimately filmed, and while it works decently well as a mainstream Hollywood drama geared towards teens and young adults, it is both very sentimental and not very faithful to the book. We open at a high school graduation in Los Angeles, where three wealthy and privileged young graduates, Julian, Clay, and Blair, celebrate in their robes while swilling Dom Perignon from the bottle. Julian is in a giddy mood because his father has just bought him his very own record company, which seems like a sensible gift for a teenager. Julian is played by Robert Downey Jr., who was still a few decades away from becoming the highest paid actor in Hollywood, but who had already appeared in such 80s teen classics as Weird Science, Back to School, and my personal trash favorite, Tough Turf. He'd also been a Saturday Night Live cast member during its legendarily terrible 1985 season, which is something people rarely seem to remember about Robert Downey Jr. Blair is played by Jami Gertz, whom we've already seen in The Lost Boys and Solar Babies, while Clay is played by Andrew McCarthy, then known for St. Elmo's Fire and Pretty in Pink. 6 months after graduation, in his college dorm room at an unspecified Eastern university, Clay flashes back to an incident from the previous summer, in which Blair tells an angry and incredulous Clay that she's not going to go to college with him, instead opting to remain in Los Angeles to pursue a modeling career. He also flashes back to visiting LA over Thanksgiving break and finding Julian and Blair in bed together. Over the Bangles' surprisingly rip-roaring cover of Simon & Garfunkel's Hazy Shade of Winter, which reached #2 on the Billboard charts, Clay flies to LA and takes a taxi to his family home in a posh Beverly Hills neighborhood. His home is expensive yet sterile, and while this film is flawed, it does a bang-up job of capturing a very specific kind of mid-80s nouveau riche Los Angeles lifestyle, while also drawing a clear visual link between wealth and emptiness. Clay goes to a lavish Christmas party at a Beverly Hills mansion, which is decked out like a new wave winter wonderland, while Poison's Rock and Roll All Night blasts over the sound system. One of these sunglasses-wearing extras at the party, by the way, is future superstar Brad Pitt. Clay gets caught up with old friends, including an enterprising young drug dealer named Rip. Rip is played by James Spader, who'd starred with McCarthy the previous year in the John Hughes classic Pretty in Pink, and who, of course, also starred with Robert Downey Jr. in the aforementioned Tough Turf. Even though he's only been away from Los Angeles for a few months, Clay appears to feel a bit out of his element at the party. As with all of this film's many club and party scenes, this scene features some outstanding set design. I can't tell which I love more, the pink flocked trees with the little television monitors embedded in the branches, or the room filled with fake icebergs, stuffed penguins, and pen and ink sketches of naked people on the walls. Clay meets with Blair in the penguin room, and they're awkwardly happy to see each other. Blair confesses that she thinks Julian is in trouble. His drug use is out of control, and he keeps disappearing for long stretches. Blair begs Clay to talk to Julian, but Clay has no interest in rekindling their friendship. Out by the pool, Clay runs into a coked up and self-destructive Julian, and they have a tense reunion. Julian, Clay, and Blair cruise around the city in a vintage red Corvette convertible. Blair confides in Clay that Julian's record company went bankrupt, which is exactly what you'd expect to happen to an 18-year-old running a record company, and Julian borrowed a lot of money from Rip in a failed attempt to keep it afloat. At another party, while the cult's Lil Devil plays, Rip confronts Julian and demands repayment of the $50,000 he loaned him. Julian responds by hitting Rip up for some drugs. Julian has grand plans to open a nightclub, which he thinks will help him get financially back on his feet. While Afro-funk legend Manu Dibango's Obele dance plays, Blair pressures Clay again into talking to Julian. To the Jimi Hendrix classic Fire, Julian smokes crack at a party. Later, he meets with his Uncle Bob at his uncle's car dealership. While She's Lost You by Joan Jett and the Black Blackheart's place, he manages to convince his uncle to invest in his nightclub. Clay and Blair meet at a club where Aerosmith's Rockin' Pneumonia and the Boogie Woogie Flu plays, where they deal with a drugged-out and argumentative Julian. Blair and Clay smoke outside the club to LL Cool J's Goin' Back to Cali. They end up making out before going back to Blair's loft to engage in some fairly passionate sex. Julian wanders around in a druggy stupor and breaks into his father's house with the intention of stealing stuff. He's confronted by his angry father, who has banned him from the house for his drug use. Julian's father is played by Nicholas Pryor, who carved out a nice little niche for himself playing wealthy yet worthless dads in 80s films. He was also Tom Cruise's dad in Risky Business. Clay and Blair snuggle in bed and discuss the trouble with Julian. They're interrupted by a sinister man named Bill, who wanders into the loft looking for Julian. Bill is played by Michael Bowen, who we have seen in Valley Girl and Night of the Comet. Blair and Clay search for Julian and find him sleeping on the beach in Malibu. Julian is still convinced his nightclub idea will solve all his problems. Later, though, he meets with his uncle Bob, and Bob rescinds his promise to loan him the startup cash. Want Figo Rave by British dub poet Linton Kwesi Johnson plays at a party at Rip's home while Julian smokes crack on the balcony. He can't repay the money he owes Rip, so Rip, who as it turns out is a pimp as well as a drug dealer, suggests Julian work off his debt by turning tricks. With no real choice in the matter, Julian does just that, under the watchful eye of Bill. Clay and Blair spend Christmas with Clay's family, where they have sex outside to David Lee Roth's Bump and Grind. Clay spots Julian lurking by the pool, having escaped from Bill. A desperate Julian asks Clay for 50 grand, and Clay tries his best to borrow the money from his very skeptical dad. Julian sneaks into Clay's home and charms one of Clay's little sisters while stealing jewelry from Clay's mother. Clay and Blair discover the jewelry theft, and during a statistically improbable Los Angeles thunderstorm scored to Slayer's cover of Inagata Devita and Run DMC's Christmas in Hollis, they scour the city for Julian. Their search takes them to a nightclub where the Red Hot Chili Peppers can be just barely glimpsed on stage performing Fight Like a Brave. At the club, Clay and Blair are confronted by Rip and Bill, who are also searching for Julian. While arguing with a coked-up Blair, Clay hits a coyote when they're out driving around. Clay yells at Blair about her drug use, and Blair yells back at him, and Clay proclaims, for not the first time in the film, that he's returning back east as soon as he can. Julian begs his dad to let him live at home, and Julian's dad reluctantly agrees as long as Julian promises to stay clean. Blair's loft is broken into, looted, and defaced, presumably by Rip and Bill. Julian leaves Blair a message saying he's going to find Rip, who is staying in Palm Springs, to settle his debt. Blair and Clay trail Julian to Palm Springs. Moonlight Drive by the Doors plays at a party where Clay chats with his friend Patty, who is played by Lisanne Falk, whom we saw recently in Heathers playing Heather McNamara. Patty tells Clay where he can find Rip. Clay rescues a drugged-up Julian from Rip's hotel suite, where Rip has once again forced Julian to turn tricks to settle his debt. Clay and Julian argue, and Clay tries to convince Julian to go back east with him. Meanwhile, at Patty's party, Blair has an epiphany that drugs are bad news, and she dumps her cocaine in the sink in the woman's room. Clay retrieves Blair from the party, where they get into a brawl with Rip and Bill. Clay and Blair speed away with Julian, but Julian's drug use catches up with him, and he dies on the way back to Los Angeles. It ends with Blair and Clay reminiscing about Julian in the cemetery after Julian's funeral. Clay asks Blair to go back east with him, and she agrees. Credits roll as Life Fades Away by Roy Orbison plays. I have a confession. I used to hate this film because I was an insufferable purist when it came to book-to-film adaptations, and I strongly resented the liberties it took with Bret Easton Ellis's book. I have since mellowed my stance. First and foremost, I think it looks great. The majority of the story plays out over a series of nights spent at parties and nightclubs, and it's to the film's credit that they don't all blur together. They're all visually interesting in different ways. Combine that with a lot of scenes of attractive young actors driving around Los Angeles at night in a cool vintage convertible, plus a strong and offbeat soundtrack, and at the very least, it provides an appealing viewing experience. It's like watching a 90-minute block of MTV circa 1987. The very good set design does some heavy lifting by trying to at least suggest the themes of Bret Easton Ellis's book that the script entirely avoids. The Beverly Hills homes of Blair and Clay and Julian are expensive yet sterile. Every time you see a Christmas tree in this film, it's clearly artificial. The film depicts a society that places an aggressive emphasis on appearance over substance, and the set design is letting viewers know that while everything looks great on the surface, nothing here is genuine. Most of the performances are good. Robert Downey Jr. is the standout as Julian, who is very charming and funny, but is also an obnoxious train wreck who lies and steals and throws tantrums, and puts his well-meaning friends through hell whenever they try to help him. Downey makes a convincing junkie. He sells us on the idea that Julian genuinely wants to kick drugs and get his act together and run a successful nightclub. but is beginning to realize none of that is likely to happen. Julian is a tragic figure, and Downey makes the most of the role. James Spader, who is incapable of turning in a bad performance, does a nice job of making Rip seem both predatory and practical. He's not sadistic in his dealings with Julian, but he does want to get a significant return on his investment. In Ellis's book, Julian doesn't die in the end, and even if he did, none of the characters, including Blair and Clay, would be able to work up any sadness about it, because everyone is so grotesquely jaded and disaffected that no genuine emotion is able to escape. They are soulless sensation junkies who commit atrocities seemingly because they've got nothing better to do. It's a novel about appalling people who do appalling things in the pursuit of instant gratification, whereas the film is about two sincere and well-intentioned friends who do their very best to save a third friend from ruin. As a sentimental and hopelessly earnest story about how cocaine can ruin your life, yeah, I think the film works okay. But it could have been so much more. Just look at Mary Harron's acclaimed film version of Ellis's American Psycho from 2000, or even Roger Avary's 2002 adaptation of Ellis's The Rules of Attraction. Both of those films were successful at retaining the cold nihilism of Ellis's writing, not to mention his sociopathic and nearly subhuman characters, while preventing any Hollywood sentiment from leaking in around the edges. I think that would have been a smarter approach for Less Than Zero, which frequently veers into schmaltz. Less Than Zero was a modest success at the box office, though critics were largely underwhelmed. It's a film with its fair share of supporters, though it hasn't had the impact on Gen X that the book had. Watching it now, it seems mostly harmless, but it also seems like a bit of a missed opportunity. Next time, 1984's The Last Starfighter confirms what we all secretly suspected deep down. Arcade video games were all part of a brilliant long-term plot to train us to fight evil intergalactic invaders. That's all I have this time. Thank you very much for joining me, and I hope to see you here later.